Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The darkness crept in without warning. One moment, the stars twinkled brightly in the vast expanse of space, and the next, they were swallowed whole by an unnatural void. Commander Olivia Reyes stared at the view screen on the bridge of the ISS horizon, her eyes narrowing as the familiar celestial patterns blinked out one by one. Around her, the usual hum of activity on the ship faltered, officers exchanging uneasy glances. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. "Captain, we've lost visuals on all surrounding systems," Lieutenant Harris reported, his voice tight. He stood rigid at his station, fingers gripping the edge of his console. The tactical officer, known for his calm under pressure, was visibly unsettled. "Confirm sensor status," Reyes ordered, her voice a sharp contrast to the growing sense of unease. A pause, then the reply from the systems officer, Ensign Turan, came. "All systems are operational, Commander, but it's like we're blind. The scanners aren't picking up anything, and no stars, no planetary bodies, nothing." Reyes clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to show her unease. Her crew depended on her. If she showed weakness, fear would spread like wildfire. She tapped a control on her armrest, opening the comms to the entire fleet. "All ships, this is Commander Reyes. Hold position. We've encountered an anomaly. Stand by for further orders." She cut the comm line and turned to Harris. "Get me a full diagnostic. I want to know if this is a system malfunction or something external." "Aye, Commander." The minutes dragged on, the quiet of the bridge becoming suffocating. The usual ambient sounds of the ship, the subtle hum of engines, the faint buzz of electronics seemed muted, as if the very air had grown thick. The crew worked silently, each of them hyper-aware of the eerie void outside their vessel. Then, without warning, a deep rumble shook the ship. "Report," Reyes barked, bracing herself against her chair as the lights flickered above her. "Commander," Tran said, his voice cracking, "we're losing power to auxiliary systems. Life support is stable for now, but the engines, they're offline." "Offline?" Harris snapped. "How the hell are the engines offline?" "We're dead in space." Reyes felt the tension in the room spike. "Calm down, Lieutenant." "We're not dead in space, not yet." "Can you restore them?" I'm working on it," Tran stammered, frantically typing at his console. The commander knew this wasn't a typical malfunction. Something was attacking them, but not in any conventional sense. The darkness that surrounded them wasn't natural. It was a presence, a force that had somehow infiltrated their systems, their minds. And it was growing. Hours passed, but there was no relief. The fleet remained trapped in the black void, cut off from any point of reference. There was no light, no stars, no familiar cosmic patterns to orient themselves. It was as if they had been swallowed by an infinite abyss. The worst part wasn't the physical limitations, it was the growing dread that gnawed at the crew's collective psyche. Commander Reyes felt it creeping into her thoughts, subtle at first, like the hum of a distant engine, but growing louder with each passing hour. Her mind kept circling back to old memories she had long buried, the failed mission, the faces of those she couldn't save. It was as though the darkness itself was feeding on her guilt, pulling her deeper into despair. "Commander?" A voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Reyes blinked, realizing that Engineer Mason had approached her. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. The stress was etched into every line of his expression. "We need to talk about the systems," Mason said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is there a problem with the engines?" Reyes asked, sitting up straighter in her chair. Mason glanced around the bridge, his unease evident. "It's not just the engines, Commander. It's everything. I've run diagnostics on all major systems, and I'm seeing anomalies that shouldn't exist. The sensors are going haywire, the eye's glitching, and we've had random power surges in places that don't make sense." Reyes frowned. "You're saying this is sabotage?" Mason shook his head. "No, it's something else. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like the ship is fighting us, like something is inside our systems, Messing with us. She felt the cold grip of fear tighten around her chest. Mason wasn't the type to exaggerate. If he was concerned, then the situation was worse than she had thought. Before she could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the bridge into brief darkness. When they flickered back on, it wasn't the steady white light they were accustomed to. It was dimmer, almost sickly, casting long shadows across the room. Commander Harris's voice wavered from his station. "You might want to see this." Reyes stood and walked over to his console. On the screen, what should have been a visual of the surrounding space was instead a mass of writhing shadows, like black tendrils twisting and coiling in the void. "What the hell is that?" she muttered under her breath. "It's not on the sensors," Harris said. "At least, not in any conventional sense. But it's there. Whatever it is, it's out there." Reyes felt a chill run down her spine. This was no mere anomaly. They were being hunted. As the hours dragged on, the crew's mental state began to deteriorate. It started small whispers in the corridors, fleeting shadows that danced at the edge of their vision. But soon, the hallucinations became more intense, more personal. Ensign Tran was the first to break. He had always been quiet, the kind of officer who followed orders without question, but after the darkness fell, he grew paranoid. He would glance over his shoulder every few minutes, muttering under his breath. When Reyes confronted him, his eyes were wild with fear. "They're watching us," he whispered. "All the time. They know our fears, our secrets. They're using them against us." "Who?" Reyes demanded. "Who's watching us?" Tran's voice dropped to a terrified hush. "The shadows. They're not just out there, they're in here, too. They're in our heads." Reyes had no time to respond. The next morning, Tran was found dead in his quarters, his body twisted in a way that suggested extreme agony. The medical team could find no physical cause for his death. It was as if his heart had simply stopped in sheer terror. The crew was in shock, but Reyes knew she couldn't afford to let them fall apart. She had to keep them focused, keep them together. But as the days wore on, that became increasingly difficult. Every member of the crew was grappling with their own demons, their own fears. For Lieutenant Harris, it was the fear of failure. He had always prided himself on being in control, on having all the answers. But now, with no clear enemy to fight, no strategy to devise, he was floundering. He began to obsess over the idea that they were being hunted by an invisible predator, convinced that if he could just pinpoint it, they could fight back. Engineer Mason, on the other hand, was slipping into a different kind of madness. He was convinced that the only way to save the ship was to destroy it. The systems were too far gone, he reasoned, corrupted by whatever malevolent force was out there. If they didn't shut everything down, they would all be consumed. "Commander, we have to do it," he pleaded with Reyes in the engine room, his eyes wide with desperation. "If we can't cut the power, we're dead. All of us." Reyes shook her head, her own mind teetering on the edge of despair. "We're not giving up." "Not yet." The illusions, the mind game as if they were relentless. The crew was trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. Dr. Patel, the ship's medical officer, did her best to keep the crew stable, but even she was beginning to crack under the pressure. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw her children's faces, heard their voices begging her to come home. "I can't do this," she whispered one evening in the infirmary, as she treated yet another case of psychological breakdown. "I'm losing them, one by one." Reyes stood by her, hands trembling at her sides. "We have to hold it together. We're going to make it out of this." But even as she spoke, she wasn't sure if she believed it anymore. Reyes tried to shake the growing sense of futility gnawing at her mind. Every moment, it felt as though the enemy was inching closer, unseen but always present, pressing down on them from all sides. The ship had become a tomb, each hallway filled with echoes of desperation. No matter how many diagnostics Mason ran or how many tactical strategies Harris proposed, they couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see. And then the hallucinations grew worse. It wasn't just fleeting glimpses or whispered voices, now it was full-blown delusions, manifesting the deepest fears and regrets of every crew member. Reyes began to see her former squad, the men and women who had died under her command during that ill-fated mission years ago. They appeared to her in the shadows of the ship, their faces gaunt, eyes hollow. They whispered accusations, their voices hissing through the darkened corridors. "You failed us, Olivia," they said. "You let us die. How long before you kill this crew, too?" She clenched her fists, trying to ground herself, but it was becoming harder. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back there, reliving that moment, seeing the explosion, hearing the screams. No matter how much she tried to focus on the mission at hand, the guilt was relentless, dragging her further into the abyss. But she wasn't alone in her torment. All across the ship, the crew was falling apart. Lieutenant Harris had locked himself in the weapons control room, refusing to speak to anyone. He'd become consumed with the belief that the ship was under siege by some kind of invisible predator. Reyes had tried to reason with him, but his paranoia was so deep that he wouldn't even open the door. "They're out there," he had said, his voice trembling. "They're waiting for us to let our guard down. We need to strike first, Commander. We need to fire everything we've got." But there was nothing to fire at. Nothing but the darkness, vast and unyielding. Mason, meanwhile, had taken matters into his own hands. The once methodical engineer had descended into a frantic, almost manic state, convinced that the ship's systems were beyond repair and that the only way to escape was to destroy them completely. He spent hours in the engine room, dismantling equipment, pulling wires, and mumbling about needing a clean reset to escape the nightmare. Reyes tried to stop him, tried to reason with him, but he was too far gone. His hands shook as he worked, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "It's the ship, Commander," Mason had said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the ship that's doing this to us. If we kill the ship, we kill the nightmare." And then there was Dr. Patel. The ship's calm, level-headed medical officer had been the crew's rock through most of the crisis, but even she couldn't hold out forever. Reyes found her one evening, sitting alone in the infirmary, staring blankly at the empty beds. "They're all gone," Patel had murmured. "My children. I keep seeing them, Commander. Every time I close my eyes, they're calling for me. But when I reach for them, they're gone." Reyes felt a pang of sorrow. Patel had left her family behind on Earth to join the fleet. Now, in the heart of the sunless darkness, her longing for them was tearing her apart. "I know," Reyes said quietly, kneeling beside her. "I know what you're going through. But we have to keep fighting, Doctor. We have to." Patel didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the empty space in front of her, as if she could see something that Reyes couldn't. The ship was breaking them, one by one. Reyes knew she had to act fast. If she didn't do something soon, there would be no crew left to save. But every time she tried to formulate a plan, the darkness seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her thoughts, twisting her mind. It was as if the enemy was deliberately toying with her, making her question every decision, every instinct. And then came the tipping point. It happened in the dead of night, though, in the endless void. There was no real distinction between night and day. Mason's sabotage had finally caught up with them. A sudden power surge rippled through the ship, knocking out life support systems and sending the crew into a frenzy. Alarms blared as oxygen levels plummeted. The emergency lights flickered, casting the ship in a hellish red glow. Reyes sprinted to the control room, her heart pounding in her chest, but as soon as she arrived, she knew it was too late. Mason stood in the center of the room, a crazed smile on his face, surrounded by the smoking remains of the ship's core systems. He had torn out half the equipment, leaving sparking wires dangling from the walls. "It's over, Commander," Mason said, his voice eerily calm. "I've done it. I've freed us." Reyes stared at him in horror. "What have you done?" "I've reset the ship. I've shut it all down. Now we can finally escape." Before Reyes could respond, Mason collapsed to the floor, unconscious from oxygen deprivation. Ray's rushed to his side, but there was nothing she could do. The ship was dying, and they were running out of time. She grabbed the comms and sent out a desperate message to the remaining crew. All hands, this is Commander Ray's. We're losing life support, get to the escape pods, now. But even as she said the words, she knew it was futile. The escape pods wouldn't get them anywhere. They were trapped in the void, and there was no way out. Still, she had to try. Ray's made her way to the nearest pod, dragging Mason's limp body with her. She could hear the distant sounds of the crew scrambling, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The fear in the air was palpable, thick enough to choke on. But as she approached the pod bay, something strange happened. The darkness, which had been pressing in on them for days, seemed to shift. It wasn't just an absence of light anymore, it was alive, writhing and pulsating like a living organism. And then, out of that darkness, came the voices. At first, they were faint, barely more than whispers. But as Ray stepped closer to the pods, they grew louder, more insistent. "You can't leave," the voices said, overlapping and distorting. "You belong to us now." Ray's froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew those voices. They were the voices of her fallen comrades, the ones she had lost in the disaster years ago. But it couldn't be them. It was a trick. It had to be. She took a step back, but the voices only grew louder, more desperate. "You failed us, Olivia. You let us die, and now you'll die too." Ray's closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The darkness was everywhere now, seeping into her thoughts, warping her sense of reality. She could feel it crawling over her skin, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. For a moment, she considered giving in. It would be so easy to just let go, to surrender to the darkness and end the nightmare once and for all. But then, through the haze of fear and despair, she heard a voice, one that wasn't part of the hallucination. "Commander Ray's, can you hear me?" It was Dr. Patel, her voice crackling through the comms. Ray's blinked, her vision clearing slightly. She grabbed the comm unit. "Patel, I'm here." "We've found a way out," Patel said, her voice urgent. "You need to get to the engine room. There's still time." Ray's hesitated. "The engine room?" "But Mason was wrong," Patel interrupted. "The ship isn't dead yet. We can still fix this." "But you have to trust me." Ray's glanced down at Mason's unconscious form, then back at the pulsating darkness that surrounded her. She had no reason to trust anyone anymore, not after everything they'd been through. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. Ray's made her way to the engine room, her mind racing. The hallucinations hadn't stopped, but she forced herself to focus on Patel's voice, using it as a lifeline to pull herself out of the abyss. She stumbled through the dimly lit corridors, her breathing shallow, her heart pounding in her ears. When she reached the engine room, Patel was waiting for her, surrounded by a small group of surviving crew members. They looked battered and exhausted, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "We're going to reboot the core," Patel said, her voice steady. "If we can restart the systems, we might be able to break free of whatever this is." Ray's nodded, though doubt still gnawed at the back of her mind. Was this real, or was it just another trick? But she had no choice. They were out of options. Together, they worked to restore power to the ship's core, their hands moving quickly despite the oppressive weight of the darkness that pressed down on them. The ship groaned and shuddered as the systems struggled to come back online, but slowly, the lights began to flicker to life. And then, with a sudden surge of power, the engine roared back to life. The darkness around them trembled, as if in response. For a moment, Ray's thought she saw the writhing shadows pull back, retreating into the far corners of the ship. "We did it," Patel whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. But Ray's wasn't so sure. Even as the ship's systems stabilized and the lights brightened, she could still feel the presence in the void, watching, waiting. "We're not out of this yet," she muttered. And then, with a deafening crash, the darkness surged forward once more, consuming them all.